Father of the Bride of Frankenstein by Daniel M. Kimmel. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Prologue. Let me tell you, this is not how I imagined my daughter's wedding day. Of course, no father can truly imagine such an event. To do so cuts to the bone of the father-daughter bond, because it means having to accept the inevitable. That his little baby was undeniably a woman and was now ready to establish a home of her own. And it means much more than that. It means accepting some outsider, some interloper who clearly wasn't worthy, as the person who would now become the primary focus of their shared lives, and that I, as merely the father, would forever after be reduced to just a supporting character. It had taken me a long time and a lot of bumps in the road to get to this point, and now, with the added support from the open bar I was paying for at the reception, I was planning on getting through it to the end. I would give my baby away. I would dance with her in celebration of that fact, and then I would see her go off with her new husband. My in-laws had had to deal with me. I suppose this would be payback. Of course, today went far beyond anything I could possibly have ever done that required balancing the scales. Here it is, only a few hours before the ceremony, and where do I find myself? Not at the hotel where the wedding and reception was supposed to be taking place. Instead, I'm hiding out at a remote cabin in the woods with my daughter and her mother. Outside the cabin are several men with guns who were, in their words, patrolling the perimeter. According to their leader, their job was to keep unauthorized people away. Samantha, my daughter, was comforting her mother, who was quietly sobbing into a lace handkerchief. Sam was in her bridal gown, and Joanne, my wife, was smartly attired in a black and gray ensemble that had looked a lot better when she had put it on to pose for some photos a few days ago. Nearly an hour riding in a van, the last part on bumpy unpaved roads, will do that to a person. Between the two of them, they were wearing a couple of $1,000s. I could only hope the chipmunk staring in at the window appreciated the fashion statement. And where was the groom in all this? He was outside waiting for Rabbi Wheaton and Cantor Eisenstein, who would be performing the ceremony. No doubt they would be surprised at the sudden change of location. After months of detailed preparation, they would have been expecting to join our 200 or so guests who were in a ballroom at a downtown hotel. Indeed, I thought, glancing at my watch, they were there right now. At least, that's what I'd been told. They would have managed to get through the mob of protesters, media, religious fanatics, and curiosity seekers who were at all the entrances, outnumbering the invitees by a ratio of 5 to 1, and then cleared a security checkpoint. There would be no party crashers at this wedding. Outside, among the protesters, were a cadre surrounding a fringe minister who had decided that this wedding should not take place at all, and that it was an affront to humanity. Add to this lively cast of characters the squadrons of police and nearly as large contingent of hotel security, as well as a sizable showing from our friends in the media. I could only hope that our guests who made it through appreciated just how safe they were while being protected from the chaos outside. At this point, I was just hoping to survive the day and maybe get to taste some of the hors d'oeuvres, $21 a person, dinner, $39 a plate, and a piece of cake, which, at $800, better be the best damn cake I've ever eaten. At the moment, we had no idea if we'd even make it there, and since we were the wedding party, we were kind of the point of the whole thing. My stomach started rumbling in anticipation. It was at that moment that the one door to the cabin opened, and there he was, my son-in-law-to-be, Frank, the love of Samantha's life, or, as you may have seen him referred to in numerous newspaper headlines, the monster. I suppose I really ought to start at the beginning, not with my marriage or Samantha's birth, of course, although there are some wonderful stories to tell, but they're probably no different from the stories you tell in your family. Every family has a collection of lore about major catastrophes the family has confronted individually or collectively over the years that get retold at every gathering of the clan. The elements differ from story to story and family to family, but they're usually amusing, the result of tragedy becoming comedy in the retelling after many years. And your mother went into labor while we were stuck in the snowdrift. We hadn't planned on a level 4 hurricane on the day of our wedding. My best man had left the ring on his dresser, back in New Hampshire. Years later, telling children and grandchildren such stories would become a way to bring the family together through reliving shared experiences. But that's not what you want to hear today. Like everyone else, you want to know how, of all the families in the world, we were the ones who got to welcome Frank into our lives, altering our trajectories in ways that are still being measured. Suffice to say, as the father in the story, I was usually the last to know anything. Indeed, right from the start, I was out of the loop. In accounting where Frank came from and how he was created and set loose on the world, I probably learned the details around the same time you did. Chapter 1. I had been sitting in my private office at the bank, doing my job, busily approving or disapproving loans when the news came in. We're a community-based bank, so we avoided the shenanigans that the bank's too big to fail had engaged in. Our clients were local startups, or established businesses looking to expand, or retailers looking to remodel. If they seemed like good risks, and most of them were, they would be approved. My desk was the end of the line. The weeding out process had mostly already taken place. I had put in my time in the trenches. Now I was upper management, which came with a nice office, a nicer salary, and the ability to delegate work to others. I like to think of my life as being similar to the bank. Strong, stable, predictable. All of that was about to change. It had been a quiet day, and a bank is, by nature, a quiet place, so when I heard a loud shriek and then a shout of, "Turn it up!" followed by the blaring of a newscast loud enough for me to hear behind closed doors, I imagined the worst. A terrorist attack or a plane crash. Unless it was taking place nearby, there was little cause for this level of noise. I went down the hall to the conference room, and saw most of our employees watching a newscast streaming on a computer monitor. It was playing on the big screen on the far wall as well. No doubt you remember where you were when you first heard about it. It was one of those news stories that cause everyone to stop in their tracks. My introduction to the story that would literally transform my life and that of my family was an anchor breathlessly reading a hastily written news report surrounded by graphics that screamed, "Breaking news" and "Authorities on high alert." To the immediate left of the avuncular anchor, the elder statesman of this particular outlet, which put him at about 45, was a graphic of a test tube with the caption, "Life from the Lab." "What's going on here?" I demanded in my authoritative voice, which was greeted by calls of, "Be quiet," and "Shh," which is not how I'm used to being addressed by our employees. On screen, the anchor was conveniently providing a recap. "For those of you just joining us, we have confirmed reports that researchers from the State University Medical Center have been conducting illegal experiments involving the reanimation of human tissue. According to people on the scene, these experiments have been going on for a period of more than a year, and have come to light because the scientists have succeeded in bringing to life a sentient human being." "It's like something out of a movie," one of the tellers watching said, making me wonder if she wasn't here, who was minding the customers. I walked out to the main area of the bank. It was deserted. I looked out onto the street, and the only activity seemed to be at the sports bar down the block. If the TV screens in the window were any indication, no one was watching the ball game if there was even one being played. I locked the bank's doors and put up a sign indicating we were closed. Someone had to take care of business. I returned to the conference room, where the anchor was clearly at a loss for words, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was saying himself. He paused to get some instructions through his earpiece. "I'm being told that a press conference is taking place at the university, and we're switching over there live." The scene shifted to a conference room not unlike this one, only packed with reporters and camera crews, as an obviously harried and clearly uncomfortable spokesman came to the microphone. "I have a statement to read and will be taking no questions at this time. The administration of the State University Medical Center was shocked to learn that a team of doctors has been conducting unauthorized and possibly illegal procedures using tissues obtained from our morgue. As soon as we confirmed that this was real and not a hoax, we notified local law enforcement, and we are cooperating fully with their investigation. Questions about what they discovered and what arrests have been made should be directed to them." The spokesman turned to go amid a roar of questions from the assembled press. One reporter with a particularly loud voice could be heard above the din. "Did they actually bring a dead person back to life?" The spokesman stopped, hesitated, and then returned to the microphone. "We wish to avoid any panic. It does appear that the latest of these unauthorized experiments involved a corpse, and that they had some success in bringing it to life. I have no further information on this, except to say that all of the people involved, as well as their experimental subject, are now in police custody. Let me make this absolutely clear. The public is in no danger whatsoever." And with that, he beat a hasty retreat from the room, ignoring the continued shouting. This was the stuff of horror stories, of course. Indeed, it was so much the stuff of horror stories that the head of the project, who had some mundane name like Smith or Jones, was quickly dubbed Dr. Frankenstein in the headlines. Looking back at it from a few years later, I'm not sure I could recall what his actual name was without Googling it. There's really no need to go through that part of the story at this late date, given that the details have become so widely known that there's not only a shelf full of books about the case, but Brad Pitt won his Oscar for playing the monster in the popular, if somewhat inaccurate, movie version. You'll probably recall that the doctors and scientists involved all went to prison on a variety of charges, ranging from stock fraud, to perjury, to misappropriation of funds, to misuse of human remains. The experiments, as it turned out, had been going on for several years and involved a number of people who had to arrange for hospital facilities to be used after hours without leaving any trace behind. They had begun with mice and worked their way through the animal kingdom before finally turning to human tissue. This last phase involved the appropriation of body parts from the morgue, which then either had to be returned or destroyed. One of the nurses who had been a willing participant got cold feet when the human experiments began. Indeed, she literally got cold feet from having to procure several limbs from the morgue. When the reanimation of a full cadaver proved successful, she decided she had had enough, and made her way to the hospital administrators. It was one thing to bring a gallbladder to life. An actual human being was something else. The resulting scandal nearly shut down the university, and did lead to the temporary closure of the entire medical center. As you might imagine, no one wanted to get so much as a tonsillectomy at a place that was now deemed in the public mind as a chamber of horrors. The local media coverage couldn't help but be lurid given the nature of the story, but initial reports referring to crimes against nature were changed when several fact-checkers pointed out that the legal meaning of the term had to do with what were once considered sex crimes. Those were among the very few laws the scientists managed to avoid transgressing. Through it all, there was one matter that kept getting deferred, and that was what to do with the human corpse they had brought to life. It couldn't be said that it had been brought back to life, since the monster, as he, and it was definitely a he, had no conscious memories of the past life that had inhabited the body. Instead, while he gave every appearance of being alive, he came across as an amnesiac. He retained language skills, but had no memory of any life prior to the moment he had awoken in the operating room. Given the popular culture's confusion over Mary Shelley's mad scientist and his creation being interchangeably referred to as Frankenstein, the monster was inevitably dubbed Frank. As he was able to communicate, it was a name that he accepted. Although it was an adult body that had been animated in the university hospital, his mind at the time of discovery by the authorities was about as well developed as a 4-year-old, and therein lay the problem. As far as a number of people were concerned, Frank's creation was a crime, not to mention blasphemous, and could not be allowed to stand. It violated dozens of laws that had been broken on the way to his birth. Dozens more were hastily enacted to explicitly ensure that such experimenting would be deemed criminal in the future. To let him live to such thinking would make a mockery of such prohibitions. Yet there was still the fact of Frank. He was not a hypothetical devised by some cruel law professor. He was alive. He could talk and understand, and as would become clear over time, learn at a rapid rate. While he could not recollect memories of any past life, it was theorized that pre-existing pathways in his brain allowed him to easily reacquire language and other concepts. By the time the government was ready to deal with his fate, more than a year after his discovery, he was as articulate as, and much better behaved than, your average teenager. When the government proposed that he be destroyed as an abomination, the public seemed torn. His court-appointed attorney arranged for the media to have unfettered access to Frank, along with a variety of officials, spiritual leaders, and cultural figures. People magazine named him the most fascinating non-person of the year. Frank told reporters he had mastered the internet and was now enrolled in an online college, where he wanted to get a degree in bioethics. In interviews, it seemed he had developed a sense of humor. Asked who his role models were in learning human behavior, he cited the Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, and Boris Karloff. Where the convictions of those responsible for his creation had happened swiftly, there seemed to be no rush to get a resolution to the case of In Re Frank. There was speculation that the government hoped that his reanimated body was so unstable that he would quickly die a natural or near-natural death. Instead, his skin, while remaining an ashen gray, had become increasingly supple. It was reported that his hair and nails were actually growing. Medical reports indicated that he was breathing, sleeping, and otherwise acting like a human being should. Could a court rule him non-human and order him summarily executed? Was he like a rabid dog that could be put down? There were those who thought so. The debate raged on, with all the subtlety and openness to opposing views that were the hallmarks of every other dispute over the last few decades of American life. But then the Pope put his 2 cents in, and that was a game-changer. Given the unprecedented nature of the situation, his remarks served to dissipate the fog of uncertainty. It was, unquestionably, the most historic interview Oprah had ever done. The Pope was a major get for any interviewer, and the media-savvy pontiff, knowing he was about to make news, wanted to reach the widest possible audience. Oprah had been informed that she could ask anything she wanted, but His Holiness would welcome a question as to the fate of Frank. A veteran media star and interviewer, she didn't have to be told twice. "One of the greatest moral debates of our time is how we should deal with the monster known as Frank," she began. "He was created by illegal experiments but has now been alive, if that's the word, for 3 years. Should he be killed? Should he remain locked up? Should he be set free? What are your thoughts?" The studio audience had not been primed for the topic, although some might have anticipated it. The Pope sat back and tented his fingers, as if he was considering the question for the first time, even though he had long known what he wanted to say. "The Church believes in the protection of life in all cases. This has not always been a popular decision, and people have disagreed with us on different points. All we can do is try to persuade others to share our view of the sanctity of life, whether it is someone facing the death penalty, where we would prefer a life sentence, or the product of a violent sex crime, where we would argue that there are not one but 2 victims." These were contentious points, and there was some rustling in the audience. The Pope put up his hand. "I will not try to convince anyone on these matters today." He turned to Oprah. "You asked me about Frank. Whatever the circumstances of his creation, I see in him another example of the miracle of life. And where there is life, there is evidence of the hand of God. I think your government is right to prevent such experiments in the future. The creation of life in this manner is presumptuous and beyond the natural order of things. And yet the fact of Frank's existence says to me that he too has a part in God's plan. Frank has indicated that he not only wishes to acquire knowledge, but to be a moral creature, to know right from wrong, and act accordingly. Thus, while we cannot know if he has a soul as you and I do, it is clear he is neither an animal nor an object. If we are obligated to honor all life as sacred, then we must honor Frank's life as well." Having delivered himself of this homily, the Pope sat back and favored both Oprah and her audience with a smile. There were a few moments of silence as the pontiff's words sank in, and then the audience burst into applause. He had cut the knot. By separating Frank from the illegal experiments which had brought him to life, he allowed the condemnation to fall where it belonged, on those who had conducted the illicit activities. It was perfectly in keeping with the Pope's views to make the distinction between criminals and the life produced by their actions. But by keeping the focus on Frank, he managed to unite people who disagreed with his church's position on other issues. The tide had turned. Public sentiment now strongly favored sparing Frank's life. 2 months later, the court hearing in re Frank ruled that Frank was a sentient creature, capable of taking care of himself. They said there was no valid argument for his continued confinement, and that therefore he was legally free. Beyond that, the court said it was unable and unwilling to rule any further. Upon his release, the state university offered him a scholarship, an on-campus apartment, and a stipend. Considering their personnel were responsible for his existence, it was the least they could do. He graduated summa cum laude that spring, and finished up his master's degree in record time. He entered the school's doctoral program that fall, and that's where he met Samantha. Chapter 2. Let me tell you a bit about my daughter. If Samantha was a different person, this story would have played out differently. But Joanne and I have just the one child, and as anyone who knows me knows, Sam is the light of my life. As often happens with fathers and daughters, we have a special bond. As I enjoy telling her, I kind of have to love her. That's my job. But I also like her. She's smart and determined, but not all full of herself. When she was little, I could make her laugh and get through to her when the other adults, including her mother, could not. When she was older, she could make me laugh. She would often present an odd or offbeat take on whatever subject we happened to have under discussion, which made our conversations endlessly fascinating. As a parent, naturally, I never stopped worrying about her. But even when I was concerned over one thing or another, I would never be too worried. She had a good head on her shoulders. That was confirmed for me when she dumped one boyfriend in high school for being too controlling. He was jealous of her male friends even after she reassured him that she had one boyfriend and the rest were just friends who happened to be boys. When he didn't get it, he was history. I asked her how she felt about that. "You told me to watch out for the red flags, Dad," she said. "Oh yes, I did." I beamed with a sense of satisfaction. She was nobody's patsy. So when she finished her freshman year of college and announced she would be taking her degree in philosophy, I tried to respect her decision. It wasn't easy. My world is more practical. I'm a banker. I like things to be concrete. Money comes in, money goes out. Everything went into nice, neat columns and added up at the end of the day. So long as everything balanced out, I never had to worry about why. Thus, when Sam announced she would be pursuing a path where all she would be asking is why, and then speculating on which answer might come closest to some ideal truth, I got nervous. We weren't spending a small fortune to send her to college in order for her to become the smartest barista at the coffee shop. I regret to say that my initial reaction to her announcement was not as supportive as it might have been. Indeed, thinking back on it, I recall Joanne and I looked at her like she was insane. "What are you going to do with a philosophy degree? Sit in the marketplace and carry on like Plato?" I asked. "You know, they ended up making him drink poison." "Exactly," added Joan. "What sort of job do you think you're going to get after graduation?" I didn't think she was being entirely unreasonable. In fact, I was making a mental note to check if one could get into business school with a BA in philosophy. Sam was having none of it. She looked at us not so much defiantly as confidently. "What sort of job? Any sort of job I want." This was the problem with arguing with a philosophy major. As her college career progressed, we found that winning such an argument was easier said than done. Her maintaining a 4.0 average didn't hurt either. Eventually, I made my peace with it. It wasn't so much that I thought this was the path she ought to be on, as finally coming to the realization that I had the chance of the proverbial snowball in hell of talking her out of it. I have no idea where she got this stubborn streak. Probably her mother's side of the family. "Look," I said to Joanne one evening, "she could go on to law school. Perhaps she'll want to pursue an academic career and teach philosophy. Maybe she'll become a great philosopher herself. She could write important works, weighty tomes that we'll leave out on the coffee table with pride and never actually read ourselves. Let's face it, she's smart and committed to her goals. When has she ever disappointed us?" That was a question I probably shouldn't have asked. Sam, no doubt, could have offered me an extensive proof demonstrating that expressing rhetorical questions couldn't actually affect reality, nor were they even able to cause the situations that would refute the premise of the question. Just because I had indicated she had never disappointed us didn't create some perverse spirit which caused her to follow a path that would lead to her doing so. The logic on that was ironclad. I wasn't superstitious. Meanwhile, if you refused to walk under a ladder or toss salt that you accidentally spilled over your shoulder, just to play it safe, you may suspect what I had done. I had tempted fate. It was a mere 2 weeks later that Sam came home for Thanksgiving vacation with her new boyfriend. For a father, meeting his little girl's new boyfriend is always fraught with tension. It's inevitable, I suppose. If this was to become permanent, he would supplant me as the most important man in her life. Something I might not like, but I was forced to admit was the natural order of things. All I could ask was that he was normal, sane, productive, and absolutely devoted to making Samantha the most important thing in his life, even at risk of forfeiting his own. I didn't think that was too much to ask. So, with a smile pasted on my face, I was ready to greet the latest pretender to the throne. Joanne opened the door, and there was Samantha, scruffy in the current collegiate style, but still our beloved daughter. How many more times would she recognize returning to us as coming home? I wanted to treasure every moment. And then I noticed she wasn't alone. Of course not. She said she was bringing a guest. The figure hulking behind her was immediately recognizable by his ashy gray skin. Joanne and I stood in the doorway, frozen in place. There couldn't be two people in the world who looked like him. Beaming, Sam made the introductions. "Mom, Daddy, I want you to meet Frank," she chirped, with a smile overlaying a tone of voice that made it clear we had better get used to him. I was more than stunned. I was completely frozen in place. It was Joanne who had the presence of mind to realize that by keeping them at the front door, we were as much as announcing his arrival to the entire neighborhood. She quickly and deftly pulled me back to allow them into the house. After they were inside and Joanne had shut the door, Frank put down their luggage and took my hand to shake. It was cool and somewhat leathery to the touch. "I'm very pleased to meet you," he said, his voice much more adult and modulated than in those earliest interviews. "Sam has told me so much about you." "And she hasn't told us anything at all about you," I blurted out. "Dad," she said in a tone that hadn't changed since she was 4. Frank now took Joanne's hand and leaned over to give her a kiss on the cheek. Turning to me, he gave me a broad smile, indicating either that he was happy to be welcomed into our home or else would soon be bringing it all down in a fiery apocalypse. "It's a pleasure to meet Sam's parents. I truly look forward to giving you both every opportunity to get to know me." We would soon learn a great deal about him. Given his unusual and very public history, there was no need to keep secrets. He was very open, often volunteering information before Joanne or I could gather our thoughts enough to formulate a question. We learned that although he had no memories of whatever life his body had lived before being reanimated, his brain had retained some basic knowledge. Thus, he had an adult command of English within weeks of his birth, but had to struggle with higher math, as he otherwise breezed his way to a college degree. As we shared meals, we learned that he ate and digested food just like any other human, although he was occasionally surprised by things we took for granted. At our Thanksgiving meal, he seemed fascinated by the cranberry sauce whose shape indicated its origins in a can, but he savored every dish, complimented Joanne on the turkey, and even had seconds. He shared with us that he wasn't going through the motions, but truly enjoyed the experience of eating, just as we did, perhaps more so, as he commented on the variety of tastes and textures. "My digestive system is human from one end to the other," he volunteered, adding that indeed all of his bodily organs functioned normally. "Do they ever?" said Sam, with a not quite suppressed giggle. "TMI, dear?" Joanne replied, quickly cutting off that line of discussion. When we finished that initial dinner, Joanne suggested that Frank and I go out on our enclosed back porch for some brandy and cigars. This was an affectation of mine, that she generously and kindly indulged me out of respect for the fact that I had spared her a lifetime of the more typical male time-wasting pursuits of golf or watching televised sports. My limited athletic ability consisted of the billiard table we had in the rec room. If a few times a year I wanted to indulge in a cigar, that was perfectly fine with her, as long as said indulgence was outside. Thanksgiving came during an unseasonably mild November, and the evening was rather pleasant. This was the first time the two of us had been alone together. I could tell the conversation was going to be awkward. I offered Frank a snifter of fine brandy that I kept on hand for such occasions. He made a show of inhaling the aroma of the amber liquid within. Whether he was actually enjoying it, I couldn't tell, but it was clear he knew what was expected of him. "I suppose I should ask if you're allowed to drink?" I said, breaking the silence. "By whom?" he asked. Legally, I'm an adult. The only one I answer to is me, provided I obey the same laws that apply to everyone else. Wonderful. This was going to be another exercise in walking through a conversational minefield. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend, I said, trying to smooth things over. I was just considering how alcohol might affect you. You mean, am I going to go on a rampage and frighten the villagers? There was a pregnant pause, and I must have looked at him blankly because he broke the tension with a laugh. Actually, my blood flows a bit more slowly now. It takes much more liquor for me to get tipsy. I should be absolutely fine, although I promise you that I will not operate any chainsaws or other machinery while I'm under the influence. There was another pause while I tried to digest what he was saying, and then he laughed again. This was certainly turning into my most memorable Thanksgiving. Here I was, sharing a brandy with a monster with a sense of humor. Even more complicated, he was a monster who was dating my daughter. I was at a complete loss for words. Not sure what to do next, I lit up my cigar. It suddenly occurred to me that he had been invited out for brandy and cigars, and so without really thinking, I offered him one. It was clear that he had either been prepared for this or had amazingly been exposed to it prior to coming into my home. Perhaps the previous occupant of his body had been a cigar aficionado. He expertly cut off the tip and inserted it in his mouth. I lit another match and brought it to the front of his cigar. I had not anticipated his reaction. Fire bad! He shouted, waving the flame away. Oh no, what have I done? As I looked on in shock, wondering whether the brandy had indeed gone to his head, Frank burst out into a roar of laughter. That joke never gets old. Now you're supposed to say, wait, I was going to make espresso. Great. That's what I really wanted to make this Thanksgiving complete. A monster who likes brandy and cigars and Mel Brooks movies. Frank took my hand with the still-lit match and applied it to his cigar, then sat back and exhaled a perfect smoke ring. In the dusk, I could almost imagine he was normal. Almost. We sat in silence for several minutes, puffing on our cigars and sipping the brandy, both activities proving to be helpful in taking the edge off the moment. Finally, he broke the silence. Samantha is a wonderful woman. She's made me see things in my studies that have opened my eyes. I'm sure you must be very proud of her. I have to admit it, you can never really go wrong praising a child to his or her parent. Feeling the warmth of the brandy, I relaxed and took in his praise. I am. I always have been, I said. But I can't say I always understand her work. Tell me, how has she helped you? Frank paused as if he wasn't quite sure where to begin, and then he just plunged in. My creation is arguably the biggest crisis in the field of bioethics. There's no avoiding it. Even after the court's decision was made to recognize my right to continue my new life, the experiments which led to my creation have remained universally condemned. And rightly so. Please understand, I have no desire to create a humanoid army to conquer the Earth, no matter what you may have seen on the internet. Well, if it's on the internet, it must be true, I offered. I think I was feeling the effects of the brandy myself. Frank chuckled. However, I don't think the experiments were entirely worthless. I'd like to establish rules to allow strict parameters for certain types of tests, and Sam has shown me a philosophical structure that can be used to do so without crossing over into those things, and here he paused dramatically, that man was not meant to know. I'm not sure I'm following, I said, taking another puff on my dwindling cigar for want of anything else to do. We need to clearly state what sorts of experiments can and cannot be permitted. Anything involving consciousness should not be allowed, obviously, but what about body parts? I poured myself a touch more brandy, not quite sure where this was going, and not so sure that I wanted to know. Body parts? Particular organs. A heart, a liver, a pancreas. If we could reanimate organs that could be used to replace diseased or damaged ones, would that not be serving the public good? Is a person with a reanimated liver any less human than ones who receive a traditional transplant? I suppose not, I replied, fairly certain this was a candidate for the most unusual Thanksgiving evening conversation ever. I don't know who would give out such an award, but I was sure we'd be eligible for it. I'm glad you agree, said Frank, oblivious to my bafflement. While my focus has been on the consequences of such work in medicine, Samantha has focused on its impact on society. It's something that's very close to her heart. Indeed, our hope is to work closely together after we get our degrees. She hadn't mentioned anything to me. No, she asked me to broach the subject. You see, it's not just a combination of career interests. She and I have fallen in love. We'd like to have your blessing to get married. You know how there are certain incidents in one's life that are just like great historic moments in leaving an indelible mark on your memory? This moment might have been one of them, but not for me. For the life of me, I couldn't remember much of anything that happened after that. However, Joanne and Sam said they'll never forget rushing out to the porch because there was a madman screaming incoherently. I was hoarse for the next several days. Chapter 3. I'm sure you can see what the immediate problem was. This being the 21st century, my options were somewhat limited. I couldn't have Frank kidnapped and impressed into service on a ship heading to Australia, tempting though that thought might be. And as we're Jewish, sending Sam to a convent was right out. I suppose I could have sent her on a birthright mission to Israel, but they were co-ed, and with my luck, she'd come back with a new peace initiative by announcing she was engaged to the son of the leader of Hamas. I was also up against the ruling that Frank was to be considered legally alive. So shooting him, assuming I was even capable of such a thing, was not only not in the cards, but putting my life at risk as well. I'd probably end up missing and wind up in prison for attempted homicide. Not getting to go to the wedding would be small compensation. Joanne and I stayed up late into the night, trying to figure out how to respond to this new state of affairs. We were all adults. Well, the jury was out on Frank's actual age, but he did have a college degree, and he had been issued a driver's license, so I suppose we had to consider him one as well. What needed to be done now was a family discussion where we, speaking as the voice of experience, would try to get them to see the light of reason. We were certain that by treating this calmly and maturely, and with a minimum of screaming, I had learned my lesson, we could get them to see the folly of their ways. It would just be the four of us. Frank, of course, had no family. His previous identity was unknown and unknowable, and it was believed his remains had been selected for just that reason. We hoped that that imbalance would work to our advantage. We gathered in the living room after Sunday lunch. Sam and Frank sat side by side on the couch holding hands. Joanne and I sat on the opposite side of the coffee table in separate chairs facing them. We tried to look serious but loving, concerned but not worried. The message was that we wanted to have a conversation, not lay down the law. Sam saw right through us. "Uh-oh, family council time," she said, turning to Frank. "They're going to try to reason us out of this." "Now, dear, we simply wanted to talk to you about—" I began. "What about children?" Joanne blurted out, apparently having decided that there was no need to ease ourselves into the conversation that we all knew we were having. She had made it clear that she longed to be a grandmother someday, sometime in the far future, when she might finally admit her age or